All right, welcome to Savold Fantasy Talk, the Fantasy Football Formula podcast. We're back after a hiatus from for a few months from March, where we did our off-season talk, which you should check out. And right here, we're talking about mainly fantasy, and then we'll dabble in a little local skins talk, maybe a little bit of movies, possibly if we get to that. So first off, let's start off. We'll start off with some situational changes. We've seen guys like DeMarco Murray, Lamar Miller, Matt Forte, Chris Ivory, Ladarius Green change offenses, and how does that impact them? John, you would like to talk about DeMarco Murray initially. How will being in a run-first offense with Tennessee affect him after being in Philadelphia?
I think it's important, especially because I think we've seen that the Titans are pretty committed to DeMarco Murray right now, whereas the Eagles, Chip Kelly just wanted to run Chip Kelly's offense, whereas now the Titans want to work with the offense that they're building for themselves, with DeMarco Murray, with Marcus Mariota. They're not going to just go with a set scheme. They're going to kind of work with their personnel, which I think is important for DeMarco Murray, because as we saw with Dallas when he was so successful, he was fantastic in the I formation, whereas he was not as successful in the shotgun with Chip Kelly. So I think if the Titans can correctly implement DeMarco Murray into their offense, it's going to be a big upside play for him this season.
Yeah, Murray, recently he was on a local Tennessee radio station. He was talking about how he really likes playing in a power run offense, and that's kind of the guy he is. He's a downhill runner. He isn't great at making guys miss, but he can break tackles if he's being a power runner, and that's what Tennessee has. And obviously, we've seen them draft a guy who really fits that offense in Derrick Henry in the second round. And I think that Murray initially will have control of the offense, but by week 8, I think it's anyone's offense, especially Derrick Henry. Investing a second-round pick, you could argue, is more of an investment than signing in free agency. Even though DeMarco Murray's contract, it wasn't huge, but it definitely was a substantial amount. I think that you should be careful with him, and it's definitely a risk signing, but even if he's a better running back than he was in Dallas and the offense fits him better, he's never going to put up those numbers again. Not even close.
I completely agree with you.
I think he'll max out at maybe a high-end RB2, but then the floor is a bust.
The thing that I would say about DeMarco Murray is in fantasy, it's very important sometimes for the first few weeks to have a cemented running back that you want to use. And obviously, the season progresses much like last year. There could be injuries and stuff. And obviously, if you could get Derrick Henry later in the season to maybe handcuff DeMarco Murray, but DeMarco Murray at the beginning of the season should have a strong handle on this backfield. I think that's the important part for fantasy. But as you said, I think we should be cautious with him in the later weeks.
I think the thing about Tennessee is they basically reached on Derrick Henry. I mean, they took him very early in the second round. They're guys that like their C.J. Proze, who ended up going to the Seahawks, Jordan Howard, then Devontae Booker, who is one of my favorite running backs in the draft, went to Denver. They clearly had a vision of Derrick Henry fitting into their offense, which I think he does, even though I don't think he will be that great of a running back in the NFL. And I think it's just something you got to worry about that.
I agree.
On the other end of the spectrum, we have Lamar Miller going to the Texans. I'll handle this one. He, in my opinion, was probably talent-wise, you can make an argument he's a top 5 running back. In my opinion, he's established himself as a top 5 running back. But the amount of carries he's gotten in Miami due to Joe Philbin's offense the past few years has really hampered his potential. Lamar Miller, he's probably one of the best running backs, as I said, but then his yards per carry is also always sky high. And if you put in Lamar Miller's yards per carry amount and touchdown percentage compared with Arian Foster, his numbers from when he was healthy in Houston, Lamar Miller, he really hasn't missed many games. He's started all 32 games over the past 2 seasons, but he also has averaged only 205 carries a season. While doing so, he's averaged about 4.85 carries a game, or yards per carry. Foster, over the 4 seasons with 13 games started, he is an average of 304 carries a season. So if you take 304 multiplied by Miller's 4.85, Miller would end up running for 1,474 yards this year. And then also when you put in touchdowns, Lamar Miller would end up having 247 points total, and Devonta Freeman, the number one RB from last year, at 244. But what were you saying?
I think that it's very important. I mean, just as someone who's watched the Texans running backs, anybody who's watched the Texans can tell that they are committed to one running back most of the time. Alfred Blue, when he came in for Arian Foster, and obviously Arian Foster himself, always got a lot of carries. And I think that's what Lamar Miller is missing. When he's able to get a big workload, he is fantastic, as we saw. And he's a top five upside running back. And I think he can do that with the Texans because they're committed to him. They have a new offense that favors him with Brock Osweiler, kind of a game manager type quarterback in there. I think it's a really good situation for Lamar Miller, and you should look to get him in your fantasy lineup this year.
Yeah, Lamar Miller, according to Pro Football Focus, was the 4th overall running back with a grade of about 8.8, I think, out of 10, or 88 out of 100. And then also the Houston Texans offensive line isn't horrible, and really in Miami it was a pretty dismal offensive line. Yeah, we have like Dwayne Brown, then Nick Martin, the center out of Notre Dame, who they drafted in the first or second round, and then Jeff Allen are 3 established good offensive linemen in the NFL. Then also we have Matt Forte, who's really pretty old now, and he lost his job, or kind of became a RBBC with Jeremy Langford last year. Has ended up signing with the New York Jets, which is kind of intriguing, and that'll be really the only running back there, because we have Powell, obviously, who always is coming on with the starting role, but ends up losing it to whoever.
And the issue with Bilal Powell this year is Bilal Powell has been able to play well as the receiving back, but Matt Forte is now the receiving back. So Bilal Powell has been playing behind Chris Ivory, who can't do anything in the passing game, and now with Matt Forte here, Bilal Powell kind of just disappears.
So Matt Forte, he's only 30, which is kind of surprising, because when you compare that with Adrian Peterson, who you'd think of as a much younger back, Peterson actually is a year older than Forte, and then I'm sure if you compared carries as well, actually Peterson's missed a substantial amount with his suspension, obviously. Forte isn't that old, and I think with a heavy workload, maybe not draft him in, what is he going in the 5th round? If he falls to the 6th round, I think pull the trigger there, because the starting running back is starting running back.
He always brings good stats. Even if he's not scoring, even if he's not necessarily scoring, he's always going to be threatening the passing game, and he's always going to get you a pretty good return on yards. And with the hard QB situation right now in New York, you never know what could happen, and he could bring in a lot of carries now as the new option in their offense.
Yeah, and then obviously there's a lot to see there with whether Ryan Fitzpatrick will sign, which I think he will eventually, but
I agree.
We'll see. And then we have Chris Ivory, and I think we'll cover that pretty quickly. Basically, Ivory's short yardage, red zone guy. Yeldon's probably, in my opinion, a better running back.
Yes, I agree, he's a better running back.
And I think Yeldon's going to take the carries from the 20 to the 20 and probably get 15 carries a game, but he's not going to get red zone carries, and Ivory's probably going to get 6 carries a game, but then get the red zone carries.
It makes it a very difficult
so
situation.
I just stay away from that.
I agree.
Offense. I think Yeldon's going in 8th, 7th round. There is some value there in that you're getting a starting running back, but then you also have to be careful. You can't. The upside limited. And then Ladarius Green and going to the Steelers. He's always been a pretty good tight end. He's obviously been hampered by Antonio Gates and not getting that much playing time. But I think he can make an impact. There's a lot of mouths to feed there in Pittsburgh with Antonio Brown and Sammy Coates and Marcus Whedon and Le'Veon Bell. Green, I think he does have some upside there, replacing Heath Miller. And I think he's good. He's a tight end. Him and Ertz, I think, is the last 2 actually real starting tight ends that can make an impact.
I think he'll see some red zone targets, but I mean, even though he's the big target in their offense now that Martavis Bryant is gone, the issue is Ben Roethlisberger is still going to find Antonio Brown in the end zone. Even though Antonio Brown is small, the Steelers offense always finds a way, either whether it's putting him in the slot or putting him on a different route or something in order to get him in the end zone. And Ladarius Green can be a solid option now that we're not in obviously a very important offense, but Antonio Brown is always going to take the looks away from him because that's always where Ben Roethlisberger is going to give his first look.
Yeah, and then we have obviously a lot of guys coming back from injuries. We have Jordy Nelson, Kevin White, Le'Veon Bell, Charles, Brian. Let's start with Bell, continuing the theme of Steelers offense. I think Bell, when healthy, is far and away the best running back in the NFL. But there is an injury risk there. He's torn his ACL, and guys can come off that. Obviously, we've seen Charles do it once, Peterson do it, RG3 obviously not, but I think Bell is still the number one running back in fantasy, but you have to carry some
caution.
Yeah,
I think
caution.
handcuffing him with D'Angelo Williams is very important. I think this year more than ever because Le'Veon Bell, obviously fantastic talent. He's the best running back in the league. There's no better option than Le'Veon Bell when healthy, but you have to be wary of him because you just never know what's going to happen with Le'Veon Bell.
Yeah, and obviously he's missed a lot of time with concussions. He hyperextended his knee in 2014 and missed the preseason in 2013. I think he's medium risks. There's a chance he does miss substantial time this year, but the talent's obviously, you should pull a trigger there in the middle of the first round.
If you can get him middle first round, I would obviously take Le'Veon Bell. Reaching on him in the top 3 picks, I'm not sure, but you're not going to go wrong with Le'Veon Bell if he's healthy.
And then Jamal Charles with running backs, he's being ranked by ESPN to go in the first 2 rounds. I can't do that.
I can't either.
2 ACL tears in his career. That's a lot, and he's not the youngest guy, but I mean, he's had 4 knee injuries in the past 5 years, ton of ankle injuries in college. That's a lot to think about, and last year when he was playing, he was the number 1 running back, but a lot of that was due to touchdown production, and I think with the emergence of Charkandrick West and Spencer Ware in that, and then Niall Davis as well, even though he didn't really make an impact, there are other running backs there, and I think he's never been a running back to be so successful due to the volume he gets, but I think the volume he will get this year will be even lower, like 3 carries less than last year, and last year was like 15 carries a game.
Especially considering how Andy Reid can't afford to lose him again, because Jamal Charles is 1 more injury away from never playing football again.
Yeah.
It's very hard for the Chiefs' offense right now, and obviously he is the most important part of their offense when healthy. They need to keep him healthy, and I think it could be a big problem for fantasy owners this year.
Yeah, Charles has sprained his ankle 6 times in his career, whether that's college, NFL, tore his ACL twice, sprained his ACL after it was surgically repaired once. There's a lot to worry about, and I think, like Bell, there's definitely an injury risk, but there's not as much upside there. Then for Kevin White, on the other hand, I think has a big chance to break out this year. When you combine the injury risk of Alshon Jeffrey and Kevin White's immense talent, I think you have a clear sleeper right there. White ran a 4.3 and was built like a bigger, stronger version of Des Bryant.
I mean, if you think about Alshon Jeffrey's emergence, it's a lot like what could be the emergence of Kevin White. Alshon Jeffrey was the number 2 option behind Brandon Marshall, and I think Kevin White could have a similar emergence as well as the number 2 receiver in that offense. Alshon Jeffrey is going to cut a lot of coverage. He's always going to draw the number 1 corner because of how big he is, how strong he is. He's a fantastic receiver. Kevin White could see a big boost in upside this year.
Yeah, and then we also have Jordy Nelson, who I think definitely draft him in the late 2nd round, early 3rd round.
I don't see much injury risk there, considering this was his first major injury.
I have him as my 8th wide receiver. Obviously, the Packers' offense just looked lost without him.
I have him as my number 5 receiver due to the lack of production from the Packers. Without him, I think Aaron Rodgers is going to look to get him as involved as possible. I think it's very important that they keep him on the field.
Yeah, and so I say Nelson, don't worry about it. Then Dez Bryant lastly. Bryant's kind of worrisome. Obviously, he missed a lot of practice time last year due to contract disputes. And also, he really wasn't that much of a factor even when he was playing, just due to the poor quarterback play with Kellen Moore and Brandon Weeden last year. He had one of the highest bad uncatchable target rates, which obviously will improve when Tony Romo's throwing to him.
And you know Tony Romo's going to get Dez Bryant the ball. I really like Dez Bryant going into this year. I think top 5 upside for Dez Bryant.
Yeah, you have to be a little bit wary there just because he has had injury history, but I think Bryant, late first-round pick, early second round, I'd pull the trigger. So also, there's a lot of new strategies coming this year. Where to pick running backs, wide receivers. The wide receivers obviously are going much earlier than usual this year. First, we'll talk about where to pick. John, we've talked about picking first overall, and though it seems like you're taking a big break, you're obviously not picking from 2 to 19. You're also getting 3 picks in the top 25.
I think picking first, this is one of the best years ever to pick first. The draft is just stacked this year in general. There's fantastic players at the 20th pick, at the 21st pick. Having the first pick at the 20th and the 21st is really, really impressive. You get Antonio Brown, great, obviously best receiver you can get, probably the most consistent player in fantasy. And then at the 20th and 21st, you have very, very good options at the running back position.
Yeah, whether it's Doug Martin, whether it's Lamar Miller, whether you could go wide receiver, LaShawn McCoy, Mark Ingram, Alshon Jeffrey. Guess you could reach a little bit on Keenan Allen.
Jordy Nelson
as well.
There's a lot of options you can take if you get the first pick. It's looking better than ever, I think.
Yeah, and then I think you could also kind of go with that idea in that if you pick within the top 3 picks, chances are you're either going to get one of the either Beckham or Brown, or then also Le'Veon Bell. Maybe someone picks a guy like Julio Jones above Antonio Brown and Beckham, and then you turn around and pick to 17. Then you have options open and where you're more likely to get a guy like Jordy Nelson, or maybe Gronk falls a foot ways. Ezekiel Elliott could fall depending on how he does in training camp and rumors about his workload. We've obviously talked about picking 7th. I think the 7th pick, with the chances are that a guy like Todd Gurley or Adrian Peterson falls pretty far, when in the past years it'd be like Gurley 1, the first running back and second running back would go 1, 2.
Exactly.
And
I think if you can't pick first or second, I think you want to go to the back end of the first round, because I've been doing a lot of mocks out there, and I think it's really nice, because if you can't get Antonio Brown, if you can't get Odell Beckham Jr., if you can't get Le'Veon Bell, there are really good options at the back end of the round. You can get players like Dez Bryant, you can get players like Todd Gurley, you can get players like Adrian Peterson. You could even get 2 of those 3 depending on what happens in your league. If you can get players like that, it makes up for losing out on maybe one of those middle-of-the-pack first-round players like David Johnson or Ezekiel Elliott or DeAndre Hopkins. I would much rather have a player like Dez Bryant along with a player like Adrian Peterson or Gronk than some of the other options that you can get in the middle of the first round, the middle of the second round. I think you want to pick at the beginning or the end of the first round this year.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And then also you have to look at, you're going to have to take a running back or wider. I think this year's a tough year to go tight end early. And I think usually it's Gronk in the first round, and then Greg Olsen would fall like the 3rd or 4th round, or 5th round even, and that'd be the second tight end. And this year we've seen that Jordan Reed's a 3rd round pick. And I think that's an investment.
I think Jordan Reed is a fantastic talent.
I agree.
But personally, I'm not taking a tight end. Unless Gronk falls, I'm not taking a tight end until much later in the draft, because it's really difficult. I think the way you have to go is if you have to go wide receiver, running back in the first couple rounds. It's hard to go wide receiver, running back. It's a big risk, especially taking a tight end because there's so many good tight ends later in the draft, like Ladarius Green we were talking about. I think you gotta wait on a tight end just like you should wait on a quarterback.
Yeah, and then I think this year we were talking about how there's the no RB strategy. But what about the no wide receiver strategy? If you, let's say you have the 7th pick, 8th pick, 9th pick, you could get probably Gurley and Peterson. Then if you wait and then you, in the 3rd and 4th round, you're able to take a guy like Thomas Rawls or Jonathan Stewart. You've 4 RBs there that are starting running backs. You know at least 2 of them will finish in the top 5. Then in the 5th and 6th rounds, there are wide receivers you can take that are established good wide receivers. You can take Doug Baldwin, Randall Cobb, Jarvis Landry. Cobb's probably going to bounce back now that there's the Nelson playing across from him. In the 6th round, it continues Devontae Parker, Golden Tate, 2 breakout potential players right there. And obviously it's a risk, but it looks like a legitimate strategy this year that could pay off.
I agree with you. I think that's another interesting strategy. Not necessarily maybe a risk that I would take, but I think it is a very interesting idea to take with those players, because the only issue is that there's running backs, that guys who can get hurt. The receivers, most of the time are not going to get hurt like the running backs are, but with running backs obviously having a much more difficult time keeping job security, if you can keep a bell cow running back at this point in the draft, I think you've got to take them.
Yeah, and the thing about, in my mind, it's always been wide receivers are more consistent than running backs. But then last year, if you look at the top wide receivers, it really was a tough year for them. Obviously, you had Julio Jones and Antonio Brown, who definitely played well. But then you have guys like Mike Evans, pretty much a bust. Jordy Nelson tore his ACL for those of the drafters that drafted not that early, but pretty early. Demaryius Thomas, bust. Dez Bryant, bust. Calvin Johnson, pretty much a bust. Randall Cobb, bust. Alshon Jeffrey, bust. T.Y. Hilton, bust. That's 7 out of the top 10.
And then you have guys like Allen Robinson, who went in like the 7th round, who are top 10 wide receivers. It's really hard to find consistency in fantasy in general, but I think you gotta take these guys like Antonio Brown, like Adrian Peterson, guys who who week in and week out are going to give you some type of production.
Now, John, let me ask you this. Would you trade your 1st round pick for a second, if you're in a league that can trade picks? Let's say you trade your 1st, 15th, and 16th pick for a 2nd and 3rd and 4th round pick. Would you do that?
I'm not sure, but I would at least consider it, because there's just it's so difficult to find consistent players in fantasy these days, and having a full lineup of guys who can put up points every week is so important that you can lose a player like Julio Jones in order to get guys like you were talking about, like Thomas Rawls, like Devontae Parker, like Allen Robinson, like those guys who aren't necessarily your superstar household name, everybody knows them, but they are going to be successful players, and they have ridiculous upside that Julio Jones or Antonio Brown or Odell Beckham can't do all by themselves.
So let's say you trade your 1st overall pick for someone's like 15th, 25th, and 35th pick. You'd end up with a type of draft where you would end up taking, let's say, who could fall at 15 as a running back? Let's say you take Jordy Nelson. Jordy Nelson, then Lamar Miller, Doug Martin, then you have the 25th pick where you can take Keenan Allen. Then you have round 4 where you could take Kelvin Benjamin, and then you can take Amari Cooper. I take that over just Antonio Brown and the rest of it. And I think depth is the most important thing in fantasy.
I agree.
When you're drafting running backs obviously injury prone, can lose their job more easily. Draft running backs when you're in round 4 through 9. Take as many as starting running backs or running backs that can
set
take
your 2 running backs, your 2 wide receivers. You got to stack up on starting running backs. It's so important. it's impossible to find a full core of running backs who are going to keep their spot for all 32 games. It's so rare now. So if you can find a player like Adrian Peterson, obviously that's more difficult, but a guy like Jonathan Stewart or a guy like Thomas Rawls who we think are going to keep their spots for the whole season, I think that's crucial to keep your players in a consistent position all year.
Yeah, and then obviously with running backs, especially this year, you have running backs like Thomas Rawls in Seattle. There are some rookies there that could take his job. Same with C.J. Anderson. And when we're talking about rookies, it's a good transition to Dynasty guys. So this year for running backs, even though, I mean, you Elliott, obviously, who's an immense talent and is going to make a huge impact in Dallas. But then you have guys that went in the second and third round. You have Derrick Henry, who I'm not crazy about. But I think in year to year, he can make an impact this year. But Dynasty-wise, I wouldn't invest too heavily in him. A guy that I really like is Devontae Booker in Denver. Booker, I compare him to a faster version of Alfred Morris. When I was doing my draft analysis, he's powerful build. He's great at breaking tackles. Runs with a forward league and drives with his legs. He's decisive and has good vision, and he accelerates. The two areas where he struggles is lacks a little bit of top end speed and might have issues with fumbling a little bit. In Utah, he excelled there. He's 5'11", 219. He's well built. I think he can make an impact even this year. If he takes C.J. Anderson's job, snatch him off the waiver wires because he is making an impact. Then you've guys like Kenneth Dixon and then also Jordan Howard in Chicago. Howard obviously could take Langford's job because Langford really wasn't that great last year. He averaged under 4 yards per carry. He did get a lot of red zone carries, but I think keep your eye out for Howard. Definitely handcuff him if you have Langford.
Same thing with Booker for Anderson.
Yeah, and then for C.J. Proze, Notre Dame, he was, again, a hard runner, a little bit faster than Booker, and he's also pretty patient and is agile lateral. He's good lateral agility. But issues there is he's indecisive, which is obviously an issue when you get to
the highest level.
Yeah, highest level. The game's faster, holds are smaller, bigger guys who probably on your nerves for the first few games, but keep your eye out for him. Derrick Henry, as I said before, if he gets volume, he's obviously going to make an impact. He's probably never going to be a top running back in the NFL, in my opinion.
He doesn't have the explosive speed to
but I think he can make an impact this year. And then this year, I thought the wide receivers were really strong in the draft. I don't see many of them making impacts just because of where they are. You have Laquan Treadwell, who was probably the best receiver in the draft, but he went to a team that really is trying to run the ball. And though they've invested a first-round pick in a wide receiver, I think that does show that they're going to try to probably lessen the workload on Adrian Peterson as he's getting up there age-wise, and whether Father Time will catch up with him. But I say wouldn't really want to draft Treadwell. Doxson, I think probably he's the highest upside in the draft. He's a fifth target after like Crowder, Garcon, Jackson, and Reed in Washington, so don't see him making an impact. Will Fuller, I think, wasn't very good coming out of college. I didn't really like him. He was one of my lower-ranked wide receivers, but he might be able to make an impact. I think he won't, but
I think the rookie receiver who has the best chance to make a big impact this year is Corey Coleman for the Cleveland Browns, because he is very quickly, and he hasn't really had to earn it, but he is coming very quickly into the position of the number one option in the Cleveland Browns offense. They don't have a running game, and they don't have any other receivers to rival him. The only issue is Robert Griffin III going to get him the ball? I think Corey Coleman and Robert Griffin could work well together, but I think he's going to get a lot of volume really quickly in the NFL, which is, I think, a big deal for him.
Yeah, Hugh Jackson coming from the Raiders, what we saw with Jason Campbell there was an offense where you run it a few times and you gun it down the field. And I think Robert Griffin, that's an offense which, if he were to succeed in, he would, because he definitely has the arm strength. And Corey Coleman, that's kind of the type of guy. He's the blur on the field. He did struggle with the drop rate. It was 10.9 in college, which wasn't ideal, obviously. But then he's also a good leaper, and he's obviously quick hands, great footwork. I think he can make an impact. He definitely has the chance to, and he's my favorite rookie wide receiver as well. There's also been some talk of Sterling Shepard alongside Odell Beckham in New York, and I think he could make an impact. They've really lacked a good wide receiver too since Victor Cruz was the wide receiver 1. Shepard was my number 4 wide receiver this year, above guys who like Fuller and Boyd who went before him. He's runs great routes. He's separation out of the break. He adjusts his routes to how the corner's playing, whether it's press or off. And I think he could succeed in New York.
I agree.
And then, so ranks, kind of an overview. John and I agreed for the most part, but places we don't agree, DeMarco Murray. I had him at pretty low, 21. John, where did you have him?
I've met 15 for the reason that I talked about earlier, about early, consistent touches. I think that's really important for DeMarco Murray. I think it's really important for fantasy owners, getting a solid running back at the beginning of the season. You never know what's going to happen to him later in the season. I still think he's going to be successful later in the season, but I really like DeMarco Murray this year. I've got him in most of my mock drafts.
Yeah, so then also Langford, I had him at 26. John, where did you have him?
I have him at 22 for the same reason. I think he's going to get the workload earlier in the year, and I'm not sure if Howard is going to challenge him if he does it all. Jeremy Langford had his bright spots during the season. I kind of like him coming into the year.
Yeah, Langford, I never really saw the making plays ability, and he averaged 3.6 yards per carry last year. All of his production was due to red zone carries, and Jordan Howard can take the ball in the red zone, and I think Langford could easily lose that job, and where he's going in the draft, I think that's you can easily see him just be a complete bust, and I think the value is just not there.
I think there are better options around where Langford is in the draft, but if you are struggling to find a running back, I think you could take Jeremy Langford just because of the early consistency he might bring.
Yeah, and then also we also have Matt Forte, and we talked about him earlier, so we'll just skip over that. TJ Yeldon, I have him at 25. John, where do you have him?
I'm at 32.
Yeah, so Yeldon, obviously, he should be getting carries probably 15 to 18 a game, but if he's able to get a red zone production, if Chris Ivory goes down, definitely a RB2 there.
If Yeldon can get his red zone carries back, and if something happens to Chris Ivory, if he falls out of the grace of the coaching staff, I would really like to have TJ Yeldon. He would move into a running back 2 role in my rankings.
And then lastly, for running backs, we have Thomas Rawls and Eddie Lacy. John and I are on opposite ends of the spectrum in that I don't like Rawls that much. John does. I like Lacy more than John. So, John, I have Rawls at tough 12. Where do you have him?
I have him at 8. I think just the workload he's going to get is going to be really great. I think when he was on the field last year, despite the injury risk that he might bring, he was fantastic when he was on the field. He was better than Marshawn Lynch was by a landslide. Thomas Rawls, I think, can easily be a running back 1 this year. I'm drafting him all the time in my mocks. I think he's going to be really good this year.
Yeah, and then obviously Rawls played well. He did miss the last few games due to injuries, and it's just a question, can he stay healthy the entire year? I mean, he took 30 carries against San Francisco, put up 200 yards. That's impressive, but you have to be worried about injuries. And also, he's going in the 3rd or 4th round this year. I'd say, sure, take him in the 3rd or 4th round, but be wary of his injury risk. But I think at that point, you can take a guy like Rawls. He's the upside to be good.
I agree.
So then Lacy, he's back in shape. Hopefully he won't lose his job again so many times this year. I have him at 8. John, where do you have him?
I have him at 18 just because of the unsure job that Eddie Lacy has. When Eddie Lacy is Eddie Lacy, I really like him. I think he does have low-end RB1 possibilities, but there's just so much unsure possibilities about what could happen with Eddie Lacy. I can't draft him as more than a low-end RB2 in a flex.
Yeah, and I think there's just, when you're getting running backs in the 3rd and 4th round and 5th round that you're starting, there's going to be risks there. And you have to just pick and choose which risks are you going to take. And he didn't play horrible. He had 4.1 yards per carry last year. Obviously not great. You don't want that from your RB2. But he still showed, even though he was huge, he could move and he could make guys miss. Like against Washington in the playoffs, he was just playing great. I do like Lacey. 8 might be a little bit too high on him, but I think there's really a drop-off there after Doug Martin. Then you kind of are getting your guys that have a lot of bust potential. And then when you're talking about wide receivers, a guy I really like this year is Keenan Allen, who obviously got injured last year and ended up missing the remainder of the season due to a punctured kidney. I have him at 12. John has him at 18, and I think Keenan Allen, Phillip Rivers loves this guy. He had 18 targets one game last year. He's probably one of my favorite redemption coming back from injury players this year. I think he could be a low-end wide receiver 1 if everything falls together right.
I think it's hard with Keenan Allen just because of the possibility of him losing a lot of touchdown potential to Antonio Gates because of how much Phillip Rivers likes Antonio Gates. But Keenan Allen, he has a lot of upside. He does have low wide receiver 1 upside. I agree with that. But there are other guys who I think are going to get a more established workload, both in the whole field and in the red zone. And that's the only thing I'm worried about with Keenan Allen.
Yeah, I mean, he posted in 8 games, 725 yards, 4 touchdowns, carried that over 16. That's almost 1,600 yards, and that's 8 touchdowns. That's definitely wide receiver 1 numbers. Then Amari Cooper, I have him at 7. John has him at 13. Cooper, I see, is one of the best breakouts this year. He's going in the beginning of the 4th round. I think if Derek Carr just relies more heavily on him, which he definitely will, in my opinion, Cooper could break out. And Cooper has so much talent. It's just a question of how much will offensive coordinator and coaches rely on him, and how much of a role will Michael Crabtree have in that offense.
I think Amari Cooper could easily break out as the top option in the offense, but yet again, we're unsure of what's going to happen with their offense. I mean, it's a young group. Latavius Murray could still take a lot of workload along with Michael Crabtree. You never know what's going to happen with them, but I do think Amari Cooper will be a solid option no matter what. It just depends whether he's a number 1 option or whether he's a number 2 option, high-end number 2 option.
Lastly, we have Demaryius Thomas, who obviously has played with Peyton Manning over the past few years, but I think he's really been a product. I like Emmanuel Sanders more than him, talent-wise. He struggled with dropping balls. He gets injured occasionally. I just don't think an offense with Mark Sanchez, Trevor Simon, and Paxton Lynch can function and carry 2 receivers. I think Sanders will be the number 1 receiver in that offense.
The only thing that I think Paxton Lynch is going to cement himself as the top quarterback in that offense. And I think with a young quarterback, you look for your big number 1 target. I think Demaryius Thomas is the big number 1 target in their offense. The only question is, will Paxton Lynch be able to get him the ball? I think he will be able to. I think Demaryius Thomas could see a lot of workload this year. He has to stop dropping the ball, though.
Yeah, and then guys I love, Amari Cooper, who we talked about, Lamar Miller, who we talked about. Ryan Matthews, I think, definitely could break out this year. Obviously, he hasn't had a heavy workload since San Diego, which he didn't really... They're talking, like, obviously he's an injury risk, but he did play well in the few years that he did get heavy workload. Yeah, last year when he did get a lot of carries, he played pretty well. He averaged over 4 yards per carry, and he is the only running back in that offense, if I'm correct to say that.
Darren Sproles obviously isn't going to be taking any carries from him.
Yeah, but then if you look, 2011 and 2013 were the last times he was a Cowboy running back, and 100 or 1,200 yards and 1,000 yards, 12 touchdowns over those 2 years. Last year he had 6 touchdowns, so they used him in the red zone. He's obviously a receiving threat as well. Posted 146 receiving yards last year. And then, as I said before, last year he had against New York, the Jets in Week 3, 24 carries for 148 yards. And then whenever he got over 10 carries, he was always averaging around 5 yards per carry. And, he had a huge run against Carolina and 6 attempts for 97 yards. I think that's production where you can invest in the 5th round or 6th round. And John, who are some guys that you like?
I really like a pair of receivers, T.Y. Hilton and Kelvin Benjamin, both who are coming back into good positions this year. Kelvin Benjamin was obviously dealing with his injury last year, but he comes back into an offense that desperately needed a number 1 option. Cam Newton was throwing to Greg Olsen last year a lot. It worked out pretty well, but if you give Cam Newton, the most valuable player in the league, his top receiver back, I think that's a really, really good situation for Kelvin Benjamin and for Cam Newton. I also really like T.Y. Hilton, who is now getting Andrew Luck back. Andrew Luck loves T.Y. Hilton. He's been his favorite target for a long time. I think T.Y. Hilton is going to return to the production that made him so valuable going into the year. I really like T.Y. Hilton for this year.
Yeah, another guy I really like, who I've always liked, is Devontae Parker. Last year he really took a while to get going, and he really cemented his role into the offense in around week 14, I think it was. And over the last few weeks, he really did play well. He started getting targets in week 10 or week 11. And over those last few games, he posted about 500 yards, which is great numbers. And Jarvis Landry's numbers during those games, they continued being at a high level. I think that Devontae Parker is probably the better receiver between the two. Definitely has more upside. But if that offense can carry 2 receivers, those are 2 really good guys. I love Devontae Parker where he's going now. I think he's huge breakout potential. Definitely invest heavily in him.
Just one other guy I really like going into the season, and a lot of people will be against taking him, but I do really like C.J. Anderson coming into this year. We were talking about Booker, who could possibly take his carries, but C.J. Anderson in the playoffs and at the end of the year last year was really, really good for Denver. And I think with a young quarterback, or if they go up to go with Sanchez, a unsuccessful quarterback, I think C.J. Anderson could see a lot of volume as he's kind of fitting into Gary Kubiak's offense now. I really like C.J. Anderson for this year because I think he's going to get the volume and I think he's going to be successful.
Yeah, and guys I hate a lot. Mark Ingram. That guy just cannot finish a season. I don't know where the love comes from for this guy, but continually he's a 2nd or 3rd or 4th round pick, and he just doesn't finish the season. He maxes out at at least 13 games a year. It's just, don't draft him. When will people learn? My God, guys that
he's so inconsistent.
And obviously when he's on the field he's good, but
he is.
He's not. Doesn't carry enough upside where you want to invest so heavily in him. I don't think he's ever run for over 1,000 yards, which would be, the most yards he's ever run for is 964. He's played 16 games once, but only had 156 carries, so he's a backup running back in 2012. He's had 5 years in the league, and he hasn't posted over 1,000 yards. That should be enough of a clue. Don't draft this guy. Especially, he's going in the very beginning of the second or third round.
You can draft a guy like that in maybe the 6th round, but in the 2nd round or maybe in the 3rd round, but most likely top of the 2nd round, you can't draft a guy like that, like Mark Ingram, because it's the opposite of what we were saying about Le'Veon Bell. Le'Veon Bell has injury risk, but whenever Le'Veon Bell is out on the field, he is fantastic. Mark Ingram does not bring...
He's good. He's above average.
He does not bring the upside that Le'Veon Bell brings that you can draft him knowing that he's not going to finish the season.
And, New Orleans, that offense is probably the biggest question mark going into this year. They have a lot of talent between Ingram, Michael Thomas coming out
Brandon
of
Cooks.
Ohio State, Brandon Cooks, then Colby Fleener, Drew Brees. Like, there's a lot of offense there. It's just, who are they going to use? Because Brandon Cooks, I thought, played well last year. But will he be able to produce in fantasy? That's the question. Then, probably another guy I really don't like this year. He isn't obviously being drafted that high, but Stephon Diggs. That offense could barely carry one receiver last year. Diggs played well when he was getting targets, and I really liked him coming out of Maryland. I was hoping the Redskins would draft him. They went with Crowder, who just performed well in the NFL, but I think once they drafted Treadwell, that's really making it tough to carry two receivers in an offense that throws maybe 20 times a game max.
A guy not too high on, and it's basically because of his draft position, is Devontae Freeman. He's really high. I could see him being the C.J. Anderson of this year. He's got a good line behind him, and that is the one thing I do like about Devontae Freeman. But I don't know if he's going to be as great as he was last year. There's no way in my mind that he's going to be able to support the numbers that he put up last year, and I think he's a really good talent. He's pretty shifty. He's quick. But I don't know if he's going to be able to support what he did last year over a 16-game period again.
Yeah, and then, Mark Ingram, we've talked about. Demaryius Thomas, we talked about. Rashard Jennings. Look, the guy just can't carry an offense. Paul Perkins out of UCLA probably will take his job by week 5. Don't invest. Just don't waste a pick on him. Blake Bortles. The majority of his production was from garbage time last year and just them being so bad and so behind so early. And I just think that they're going to be a decent team this year, and the volume he'll get and the touchdown production he had last year will definitely go down.
Another guy I'm not a fan of, another running back, Amir Abdullah. I just don't see him putting up consistent fantasy points. He's quick. We've seen him. He has breakaway speed in the league, but he can't get through the line most times. He's not a fantastic player to use because he's just not going to get that much volume. The Lions have always been a pass-first offense. Don't draft Amir Abdullah higher than you have to. Maybe if he falls to you, take him because of the fact that he's a starting running back. But he's hard to take because you know Theo Riddick is going to take some...
Yeah, that offense is pretty weird because they have two great PPR guys, but it's only third down once if it's that, you Theo Riddick, who's great receiver, one of the best in... I'm pretty sure Pro Football Focus ranked him as the best receiving running back. 99.9. That's damn good, but then he can't run. And then you also have Amir Abdullah, who, he won't be able to take him more than 15 carries a game. He's not built for that. And that's a pretty weird offense as well. And then a few sleepers. We talked about Corey Coleman. The rookie running backs I all really like. Dorial Green-Beckham probably. And then Devontae Parker. But Dorial Green-Beckham I like coming out of college. If he's able to cement a role as an X receiver in Tennessee. And Marcus Mariota did find some chemistry with him later in the season last year. I think he could be a solid flex.
A guy I really like who has really fallen in rankings, a guy I didn't like last year, but I do now that he's fallen, is Giovanni Bernard.
I agree.
The guy is just a rock as your flex position. He puts up 9 or 10 points every week. He's very solid, but people don't like because he's not a starting running back. I'm not willing to draft him very high, but now that he's fallen so far, I really like Giovanni Bernard. I have him as my number 29 running back, which obviously is not that high, but for a not starting receiving running back, Giovanni Bernard obviously limits Jeremy Hill, but he is a great talent. He's so good, and I could definitely see reaching on him just a little bit late in the draft.
Yeah, so obviously some breakout teams this year, which we talked about, the Bears and the Redskins. We were talking about this earlier. When you think about them, they don't have a ton of talent. Then when you think a little bit more, they have one of the best cornerback cores with Norman, one of the best, probably top 3 corner with Peterson and Sherman. And then you have Rashad Breeland, who's the best run defense corner in the NFL. by a long shot, and then also you have Kendall Fuller and Quentin Dunbar who really emerged. I think that's a lot of potential there. Then you have on offense, wide receiver. I didn't even think about it like this, but we probably do the best receiver core in the NFL. When you compare Jordan Reed, Pierre Garçon, Deshaun Jackson, Jameson Crowder, and Josh Doxson, there's a chance we could actually repeat. And I was pretty pessimistic coming into this year, but now I'm letting myself become cautiously optimistic.
The only problem, I think, is not internal. I think the problem is the Dallas Cowboys. Because I think the Cowboys offense, with Romo coming back, with Des Bryant hopefully coming back to his full form, and Big Zeke coming into the offense, I think that offense is dangerous. The only thing holding them back that the Redskins do have over them is their defense. The Cowboys just don't have an elite defense, and the Redskins now do. It might not look like that on paper, but they have a very solid defense. The Cowboys offense, though, I do think could be better than the Redskins, but the Redskins receiving core is looking very good. The question for me, for them, is can Matt Jones hold on to the football enough to be a bell cow running back in this league?
And then that's about all we have for today. So, from John Schooner, Chris Savold, this is Fantasy Football Formula, and see ya!